We are delighted to be joined today by Joanna Kafarowski. This event is thanks to the Canada Council and the Writers' Union of Canada, and we really appreciate their support in doing this event. Dr. Kafarowski is an independent scholar and a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society and a member of the Society of Women Geographers. Dr. Kafarowski is the author of The Polar Adventures of a Rich American Dame, A Life of Louise Arner Boyd. And that's the book that we'll be talking about today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Lovely to be here, Liz.
So for those who may not have yet read the book, can you tell us a little bit about your subject, Louise Arner Boyd?
Sure. I think the first place to start would be, I just wanted to acknowledge the kind invitation from Liz and the County of Prince Edward Public Library for inviting me today, as well as the financial support from the Canada Council and the Writers' Union of Canada. And also I'd like to acknowledge that I am living and working in the traditional territory of the Letwungan people. So just wanted to say that first. In regard to your question, this remarkable explorer, Louise Arner Boyd, came to my attention about 15 years ago when I was in the Arctic doing my own doctoral fieldwork. I just happened to read a reference to this unusual woman who was starting out as a very wealthy woman in California, who then decided to fulfill a lifelong dream and go to the Arctic. And so I just read this passing notice about her and thought, gosh, I've really got to learn more about her. And when I returned to my university, found to my chagrin that there was no comprehensive biography that had been written about her. So that just was lodged in my brain for a number of months. I returned to my usual life as a lecturer and a consultant at the university. And then a few months later, I went with my family to California for a family holiday. And my husband, my children went to the beach, and as is my own personal interest, I went to the museum, I went to the archives, and happened upon this marvelous collection in the Marin History Museum, which was a very small collection at this time, and had a delightful afternoon rooting around in a very dusty basement, and found all these marvelous boxes and thought, oh my gosh, there's a really interesting story here. So again, I went back to normal life, and then found that over the coming months, this woman's voice became louder and louder in my mind. And I found that eventually it became so loud that I had to listen to her carefully. And I decided to leave behind my life as a lecturer and devoted myself full time to research about her.
Well, it's very interesting. And so what inspired you to write a biography of her? What was it about her that sparked your interest so dramatically?
Mm-hmm. Well, once I decided to leave the academy and started conducting some of the initial research, I was attracted to her because she was an explorer, because there were very few women explorers that had been working during the early 20th century. And after I had been working on her life for a few months, I became more intrigued because I discovered that she had led a double life. That in fact, on one hand, she was this very daring woman who organized, financed, and participated in 7 expeditions to Greenland, to Franz Josef Land, Jan Mayen Land. And then she returned back to her home in California. And there she re-entered her other life, which was as a wealthy socialite, philanthropist, patron of the arts. And really throughout her long life, she maintained these 2 separate realms. And I was just completely intrigued by this. What would have led a woman to have conducted her life in this way? what drove her to continue going to the North. And that fascination with this woman really drove me as a biographer to discover more and more about her. One of the interesting elements is that because there were no other true biographies out there, I was really, as a biographer, I had to conduct a considerably greater amount of research myself, because of course I could not refer to other biographies. So I did actually 10 years of research when I crisscrossed Scandinavia, crisscrossed North America, going into libraries and museums and doing interviews. And it became an obsession, obviously, because 10 years is I mean, it takes a long time to write a biography anyway, but 10 years I think is kind of going a bit far. Even I recognize that. But she was she was just so extraordinary that I felt very strongly as a biographer that I had to do my due diligence. I had to uncover as much as I could, knowing that future biographers would be referring back to my book, and I wanted to make sure that I did everything right.
I think that's clear throughout the book. You have so many references and photographs and pieces of art throughout that sort of you get the sense of how much research you must have done. But I thought it was interesting. It sort of starts with, if you have more information about her, please contact you through the publisher. And I found that very interesting. I haven't seen that in many biographies.
Yes.
And I thought that was very unique, to sort of stay open to the fact that maybe you didn't discover every single thing.
Of course. I mean, even now, you know, the book's been published and it's been out in the world. I still find myself, you know, conducting some research on the side apart from my current project, and making sure that if there are further developments that I'm kept abreast of that, and make sure that information is out in the public sphere. Because I mean, my goal in writing the book was to make sure that I shared this woman and her life and her accomplishments with the world, and made sure that people remembered her and remembered what she did, and used her as a base to discover all kinds of other women whose stories remain uncovered.
So given that she was so interesting and unique, why isn't she better known? I've never heard her name until I discovered your book.
Yes. There are several reasons. I mean, during her lifetime, when she was working, she was a contemporary of many other famous male explorers, you know, Peary and Byrd, Hubert Wilkins, Vilhjalmur Stefansson. She was as well known in her time as any of these male peers. She was covered, her accomplishments were covered, her explorations were covered in the newspapers. She was honored by governments across the globe. And so the reason why now she has not been as remembered for various reasons. One is that she did not marry, she did not have children, and so there was no one to carry on her legacy. As for example, you know, Cook and his daughter carried on her work, Stefansson's wife did. And in almost all cases of these male explorers, her contemporaries, there was someone to ensure that after that explorer died, their papers, their artifacts, and their what they accomplished, what their scientific contributions were, was maintained, and that legacy was nurtured. And Miss Boyd did not have that at all. When she died, she had very few close relatives at all, and there was, in her case, no one to continue on her legacy. Another reason is that, as I indicate in the book, she was very careful during her lifetime to ensure that her papers were given to various organizations. So there is documented proof that she, after each of her expeditions, she left the maps, the films, her papers with the American Geographical Society Library and Archives. And during the Second World War, when she was working as a military consultant, she gave or lent many of her, again, further films and documents to the American government. But over time, excuse me, these have been lost. And I conducted quite extensive searches in various government branches and with the American Geographical Society libraries, which actually moved during the time I was writing the book. And these papers have been lost. These thousands of her films and precious diaries and journals are nowhere to be found now. And so, of course, without recourse to her primary documents, her journals, we are unable to assess her true contributions as an explorer. So that's another reason why she's not as well known. And also, last and not least, is the fact that she was a woman, and the fact that she was of a certain class, that she was very wealthy, has acted against her in this regard, because people tended at the end of her life and after her death to marginalize her accomplishments. So, many reasons why this happened.
Well, I think that's a shame, and I think your book has done a lot to sort of correct that, at least to people that have discovered it, and I'm glad today that others will who haven't yet read it. Would you read a little something for us from the book? Mm-hmm. And while you're doing that, I would encourage the people who are watching to consider if they have any questions, because we'll have a chance to ask more questions after the reading.
Great. So the passage that I'm going to read to you is from the prologue, and just to put it into context, Miss Boyd had two expeditions, or had two journeys to the Arctic before she really decided that the trajectory of her life had completely changed, and that she was going to be an explorer. So this passage is from the 1928 expedition, which is when that had concluded, she decided that she was devoting her life to being a polar explorer. And so this was quite seminal in her life. She gripped the ship's railing tightly with both rough-gloved hands, while gazing somberly into the sprawling darkness of the frozen night. Tall for a woman, broad-shouldered, wavy brown hair tucked under a snug cap, framing a handsome face with piercing blue eyes. She could easily have been mistaken for one of the crew. Beneath her feet, the hobby juddered and jarred as it made its way through the icy waters of the Arctic Ocean. The air was a constant thrum of men's guttural voices, the clang of thick cables and ropes, the bursting swell of the ocean as the ship slammed through the seething waves, moving forward on its perilous mission. Though unaccustomed to life on board ship and only recently acquainted with northern waters, California native Louise Arner Boyd found herself profoundly moved and invigorated by the experience, and more than a little unsettled. Whether above or below deck, she was never alone. There were always experienced seamen keeping a watchful eye on the gently bred American socialite who had somehow become an integral part of one of the most desperate quests in polar history, the 1928 search for missing famed Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen.
I think that's just a great passage. It really paints a picture of what her situation was. So I think what I have read about you've worked in polar regions yourself. And what is it about the polar regions that has inspired you, or wanted to work there?
Well, I guess it starts, back when I was quite young, and I had never been to the north. I was brought up in Ontario, which is cold, but not that cold. And I actually never made it to the Arctic myself until I was in my 20s. But somehow this was the landscape that called to me, that always resonated and captured my imagination. And this was primarily through reading about it, through hearing about what life was like there, through history. And so when I actually went there, and then shortly thereafter, after my first just visit as a tourist, I started my scholarly work in that region. And like Miss Boyd, I just found that when I'm in the Arctic, when I'm in polar regions, my spirit sings. And so this was really a delightful element of writing this book, because this was also the case with Louise Arner Boyd. She, growing up in California, she actually never saw snow until she was nearly an adult, but always felt compelled to visit this region. And it wasn't until she was in her 20s as well that she visited it. She knew before she went, as I did, that this was going to be the place that that she would always be returning to. And I've found myself that when I have been either visiting as a tourist, or in the last decade or so, going more frequently for my work as a consultant and a lecturer, that you just feel, or I just feel completely at peace there. I'm also very intrigued by the life of Inuit, and the life of Inuit. And so this enables me to both capture my interest and my interest in indigenous peoples, in cultural resources, as well as natural resources. So it just is it has the full package.
So over the 10 years that you worked on your book, did you find that your opinion of Louise Arner Boyd changed?
Interesting question. I think that because my relationship with this woman, my biographical subject, was quite intense, because it lasted for such a long time, and in fact as you know, as I spoke to you earlier, it has not gone away. You know, she's still in here. She's quieter now, thank goodness, but I still live with her. And it's an interesting situation, because I actually have a very short attention span. You know, I say that there's very little in my life which has been a constant, one exception being my relationship with my husband, who I've been married to for 34 years now. But apart from that, how I could be committed to one project for over 10 years was astonishing even to me. And so one would expect, as I hear from other people, that once their book is finished, then, you know, they are happy to have that project concluded, close the door, gone on to the next one. But you know, Miss Boyd is something special, and I find that if it's possible, I have even greater respect for her now. It's given me such joy as her biographer since the book's been published. It had a really wonderful reception, and there's been various things on television with the through public television. There's been a film called Unladylike about her. There have been other various spin-off projects, and she's been people are rediscovering her, and so I feel quite moved when I hear people talking about her independently, and I still, you know, we just go through life together, and my admiration for her just gets greater.
I think I heard you say, I don't remember, it was an interview that I watched her on YouTube, that she's your favorite person, which I thought was kind of neat. But do you think that a biographer has to like their subject? Like, you clearly do, but do you think that's the case for all biographers?
You know, when I had some off time and I was reading other biographies, or reading material by biographers, just about, essays or things about the art and science of writing biography, I had read various opinions about that. Myself, I would wonder why anyone would not want to write about someone, not necessarily that they liked, but to me, it's important that you respect that person, because, I think to myself, I spent over 10 years writing and researching, and that's a considerable part of my life. And why would I want to spend that time on someone who is not, in my opinion, worthy? There are many historical figures, of course, whose lives should be illuminated and written about, and perhaps the biographer doesn't like them, but I think respect is something that has to be there.
Makes sense to invite someone into your mind for that period of time. You have to.
It would be uncomfortable, and it's like there's someone, as you say to me, she's living in my mind, she's living in my home. I share her with my family, my friends, and if it wasn't someone who was of interest, then it would be difficult. It would really be a challenge. So but people have different opinions, and that's mine.
So we've got a couple questions from the audience. Joan wanted to know, what would you say are Louise's greatest achievements in the North?
Greatest achievements. Well, she had many. She certainly was responsible for many scientific contributions. So there were various geographical land features that were named after her. There was various new technology that she developed in regards to probing the ocean floor, measuring the distance. She was a pioneering photographer. So she took, there was thousands of reels of moving film, of actual photographs. She was responsible, I think for me, one of her biggest accomplishments that is of relevance today is the fact that she worked almost exclusively in Greenland, primarily in East Greenland, but her 1941 expedition was on the West. And her journeys there were often returning back to the same small bays and coves and going over land and taking pictures and being very methodical in documenting really minute features. She was also responsible for taking pictures and gathering data and measurements about glaciers. So in fact, a lot of the photographs and films that have survived, some have survived, and those that have survived are primarily at the University of Milwaukee in Wisconsin. But the material that has survived is actually used nowadays by contemporary glaciologists. They're using her historical photographs for documenting glacial recession. So the work that she conducted by herself and with the scientists who work with her has been useful today for current scientists. So, to me, there are many different areas in science. She was also a botanist as well. So photography, glaciology, oceanography was all very important. Another thing is that she hired scientists who were proficient in their fields, and they were usually early career scientists. So she was able to give them a lot of experience that was very useful to them in their later life. And so they would carry on and be very well-known professors or writers, and she was able to give them a head start in life and in their careers as well. So she's also important for that reason.
That's interesting. So someone else has asked, if you were to meet her today, what would you ask her?
Gosh, it's one thing I wondered when I was writing her biography was if she would even be pleased to have her biography written, and perhaps more importantly, if she'd be pleased that I was the one writing it. So the thought of meeting her, it kind of makes me a bit nervous, I have to say. But if I met her, gosh, you know, there were some things I wasn't able to find. She was not, in her writing, she was not a very introspective person. She kept a lot of things hidden. Her private life, you know, any romantic life she had, she really obscured that very successfully. And so there are things about her like that that I didn't know, but I wouldn't ask that. I think what I would like is to have just a really good natter about her love of the North and share that with her. Just the two of us, you know, two girls who love the North, just sharing their passion, just to have that moment with her rather than, you know, pick her brain for those things I wasn't able to get at.
I think we would all like to sit in on that conversation if that were possible. It sounds amazing. So Ellie says, great book, great writer, great researcher, great presenter. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
What was your favorite experience when conducting research for the book? It's another question that's come in.
You know, I find the whole process of being a biographer a very intimate one, and perhaps more so when it is the first comprehensive biography, as it was in my case, because you have to not only spend so much time, but you have to go deep, and you have to go, you know, as a biographer, you determine how long you go, how deep you go, what questions you ask. And so it's a conversation between you and your subject. And I think those moments that were most evocative for me as the biographer were those moments when I felt it's almost like a thin place, which is referred to in theology as those places that where you visit in the landscape in which there is, you know, that veil between what is beyond and what is earthly is, you know, is more ephemeral, is more, you know, is you don't feel as rooted in the earth. And so those moments that I felt closest to her were, there was one time when I was actually in Newfoundland, which is where her 1941 expedition started. Well, it didn't start from there, but it stopped in Brigus, Newfoundland, because that's where her captain lived. And when I visited there, I was able to stand on the promontory that was kind of overlooking the area where the Veslicari was sank many years later, nothing to do with Miss Boyd, but that moment was very moving to me. But I think the most particular moment when I felt closest to her was when I was in Marin County, where in San Rafael in particular, where she lived, where she was born and where she lived throughout her whole life, and where her home, her mansion Maple Lawn, is still located. And I knew that she was not buried, as I indicate in the book. She requested that her ashes be spread over the Arctic, and unfortunately, we don't know if that was actually done. So I know she wasn't buried there, but her family, her two brothers and her parents, were buried in the cemetery nearby near San Rafael. And I was given permission to enter the crypt where her family members were buried. And I was given the key, and it was just a very small space. And I went in by myself, and there were her, you know, where her parents were there, her brothers were there. And there was a little broom and an old flower. And I closed the door behind me, and it was such an unearthly feeling, because I realized by the state of the place, and also by the permission that I had to get to be there, that in fact, one of the last people to be in that physical space would have been Miss Boyd herself. And she was very, very devoted to her parents, to her brothers, and spent a long time coming regularly to the crypt. And it was unexpectedly a very moving moment for me, because I just knew it just felt like she had been there a month ago, and she died in 1972. And so it was just one of those moments that I felt there was this connection, and that had occurred. There were smaller moments, but that one was really, really hit me hard.
Something about being there, I think, that really.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So someone else, John, has asked if you can provide a little more information about her personality.
She was, it depends. I think it depends on who you would ask. So, for example, if you read the book and you read some of the comments made by a few of the scientists who worked with her and who did not get along with her very well, they were very harsh, very critical, and characterized her privately as a woman who was sort of a clickety-clack, who talked all the time, who was didn't always use the correct grammar, who always tried to put herself forward. And yet you speak to someone else. One of the interviews I conducted was someone who came from a very wealthy family, one of her neighbors, and grew up with her. He was a very young boy, and knew her from when he was a young boy until he was a teenager when she passed away. And he described her quite differently, as someone who was very generous with her time, very caring, interested in what he was doing, always wanting to share her own experiences with him. And so I think, like anyone, she was a very complex individual. She was very secretive. I'm reminded of one of the interviews I did with a couple who were contemporaries. So this man in particular was in his early 90s when I interviewed him, and he lived in a way similar to Miss Boyd, in that it was, kind of if people are familiar with San Francisco, it was a very old, moneyed San Francisco family, and he lived currently, or when he was alive in the 90s. In the early 2000s when I interviewed him, they had servants, they had a certain way of life that was similar to how Miss Boyd lived. And when I spoke with him, he had only a dim understanding of what she had accomplished as an explorer. And in fact, when I mentioned him, did he remember this particular expedition? And he said, well, he remembered hearing that she went on a yacht somewhere, maybe somewhere up north, to see the polar bears. And it was just obvious that she was very skilled at putting different parts of her life, different parts of her personality into these different boxes, highly compartmentalized life. And so for me, one of my joys as a biographer is that I got to see the whole picture. I got to see her as the confident socialite, and as the daring explorer, as the lonely older woman who had many of her contemporaries dying off and was losing all of her money. And so overall, to look at her, I see someone who had been traumatized by the loss of her brothers, the early loss of her brothers, really suffered because she had no close relatives to share things with. She had no family, or chose to have no family. And so she really poured everything she had into her life as an explorer. Yet at the same time, she wasn't fully able to share that with those friends and colleagues that she had back in San Rafael. So a woman who was complex, who was very skilled during exploration, while at the same time, lacking in or not being a very assertive person in San Francisco. So, complex, multifaceted.
It seems like that would be necessary to have that kind of double life that
Yes.
she.
Yes.
I think it would be difficult to go around the social life acting like an explorer. Maybe that might not work. So Karen has asked about her formal education.
Mm-hmm. This is something that people often are surprised about, because in fact she had no formal education whatsoever. She had went to a finishing school early on, so she actually her education finished when she was about 15 or 16, and this was something which actually she struggled with later on when she decided to devote her life to scientific explorations and scientific expeditions. She, as I said, was responsible for hiring these different scientists. And so knowing that she had no formal education herself, she was very skilled at networking, at using the people that she had around her. She formed a mentorship with individuals at the American Geographical Society. So although she didn't have the education, although she didn't have family members to advise her, she was good at identifying the people that she needed to do what she wanted. So she used that to her advantage. Unfortunately, during the expeditions, as I mentioned in the book, this lack of formal education was used against her by the male scientists, who felt that although she had the experience of being a polar explorer, she had been on various expeditions herself, whereas they had not. They thought because they had a PhD, they knew better than she did. And so, as you can imagine, this kind of led to major clashes. And she, in many cases, would not back down.
Well, I guess to achieve what she did in the position that she was in, she couldn't be the type of person to back down.
I agree. And I was behind her all the way.
Well, yeah. So having worked yourself in the polar region, do you feel like you have a lot in common with her?
Yes, and this is a kind of a gray area where biographers are concerned, and I think this is just my own thing, or maybe some other biographies feel similarly. But certainly a starting point was our love for the North, our passion for the North. Something else I think was that she was a member of a marvelous organization called the Society of Women Geographers, which was started in the early 20s, started by a handful of women who were similar to Miss Boyd, were geographers, were anthropologists, were explorers themselves. At that time, the Explorers Club in the United States would not accept women members. And so the Society of Women Geographers was formed as a corollary group to that. And as I know some of the viewers are alumni of St. Clement's School, which is a girls' school in Toronto that I went to. As we know, it's often very beneficial for women to have women-only organizations. Women are better able to learn and thrive and share in these types of environments. And so Miss Boyd was, as I said, an early member. She joined in the 30s and joined this group of really outstanding, unusual women who really didn't give a damn and just went out and did what they wanted to do. They had, outstanding members. Eleanor Roosevelt, Margaret Mead, Amelia Earhart were all members. And so this group was very important to her in allowing her a milieu in which to be nurtured and to learn from and share. And this organization is still in existence today. I'm proud to be a member. And so that was something else we shared in common. I think something else is that she, even though the arc of her life was seemingly established by the time she was in her 30s, she had been raised by, as I said, wealthy parents and had been involved in giving back to the community. And it was expected that she would just continue that life in Marin County. And instead, when she lost her parents when she was in her late 30s and inherited a substantial personal fortune, she decided that instead she was going to just flout all conventions, follow her heart, follow her passion, and do what she needed to do, regardless of her age, regardless of what anyone thought. And this is something that I personally have tried to live by as well. That is something, it doesn't matter how old you are. If you have a goal, if you have a dream, then you need to follow it wherever it might lead.
So what are you working on next? That's come in a couple of times.
Yes.
We're very curious what you're up to next.
Yes. Well, this is a question that started haunting me 3/4 of the way through the book, when I was working endlessly through various drafts, and I felt, as with Miss Boyd, which she in effect chose me, even though of course she was dead. She came to me, and I always felt that this would be the case with my next project, and indeed that is what happened. So what transpired was that after the book was published, I was doing a book tour in the United States. I was speaking at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and in the audience was a woman named Karen Ronnie Tupik. She is she's the only child of the explorer Finn Ronnie and Jackie Ronnie, his wife. And they are well known primarily for the 1946 to 48 Ronnie Antarctic Research Expedition, which was quite controversial. And I knew of Jackie Ronnie as being a friend of Louise Arner Boyd. And I had actually tried to contact Jackie because I knew that she had been friends with Miss Boyd. But unfortunately, several years early, when I tried to contact her, she had developed dementia at that point, and her daughter didn't feel that an interview would be helpful. But after the lecture, Karen and I got together for lunch, and we were chatting, and I was aware that Jackie Ronnie had not had a biography written about her either. So Karen and I talked, and she ruminated about the idea for a while. I thought about it as well. And I am delighted to say that I've been working on her biography for the last 2 years. And so Jackie Ronnie was an Antarctic pioneer. She was actually one of the 2 women to be the first to overwinter in Antarctica. She was the first woman to take part in an Antarctic expedition, and really played a key role in that expedition, as well as throughout the rest of her life, where she worked in trying to advance Antarctica. So she is, although she has many connections to Miss Boyd, her life and her contributions were quite different. She wasn't an explorer per se, but she was certainly a woman who was critical to the history of Antarctic exploration. So busily engaged on that right now.
So is that an easier research project, knowing that there's still family to speak to?
Different. It's a curious shift between someone who was difficult to find and went all over the place, to someone whose life was focused in fewer areas but more concentrated, and with a certain family member. One of the challenges there is that the need to be more diplomatic and tactful, both in your interviewing process and in dealing with the family, has its own challenges, has its own rewards, definitely, but its own challenges. So both ways of writing biography are different.
Makes sense. So do you think this will be another 10-year project, or can we expect sooner?
Well, actually, I'm really pleased because because I was able to work more intensively over these last 2 years. I am hoping to have my first draft finished by Christmas. So the answer to that is no. I mean, one of the benefits of writing the first biography is, of course, I know now how to write a biography. When I was writing The Polar Adventures of a Rich American Dame, I actually wasn't clear until near the end of the process if it was going to be a biography, or if it was going to be narrative nonfiction, or if it was going to be a fictionalized biography. Very subtle but important distinctions between the three. And so I think that the learning process was extremely helpful and enabled me to streamline what I'm doing now.
Interesting. So we have another question. More generally, how did you become a biographer?
I think the same thing that I mentioned, that Louise's voice was, Miss Boyd's voice was in my head, is that biography chose me. I never expected to be leaving the academy. I always thought I would be a professor and continue on in that work. But I just found, as I said, because I was compelled to write about her. I had written another book before there, edited another book of nonfiction, quite different, a scholarly book. But I found that at that point, when I was writing about Miss Boyd, that was just something which consumed me. It was completely natural. It just was always a part of me. So there was never a question. Once her voice became so present to me, I didn't have a choice. I didn't ever think to myself, oh, should I stop now and do this? I mean, there were times that I thought, gosh, this is a little hard going. And honestly, then the voice got really loud. There were 2 points in my life where I was, personal things happen, and then I had to put the book aside and deal with those personal issues. But then she came back, and I found the same thing with Jackie Ronnie, that it was just a natural progression. I'm in it. This seems like the natural thing. And when you are doing what people call right work, when you are doing what you should be doing, where you should be doing it, and it's just, there's no question to me that this isn't what I should be doing. Now, my next project after this one is finished is a little different, and that's good too. So I just learn, the older I get, I find the more I listen to my inside voice, and I do what I'm told.
Well, that is amazing. I am just so excited to have you here today, and I think that the number of questions is a sign that everybody is as excited as I am. So thank you so much for being here, and we'll certainly keep an eye out for your new book, because we'll be excited to ask you to speak to us again then.
Oh, thank you so much.
So for everybody who's watching, we do have a copy of the book in the library, both in print and as an ebook. So if you haven't had a chance yet to pick it up, I would encourage you to do that, because it's just amazing and so interesting. It's such an interesting life that you've captured. So thank you very much for being here. And another thank you to the Canada Council and the Writers Union of Canada for making this possible. We really appreciate it. And I think Dave's just about to tell, yes, we've just got this slide up here about our upcoming author event. I think it might be of interest to people who have enjoyed this, because it is Catherine Kutenborough and Catherine Bush. And one of the things that they're talking about is the climate crisis and ecological loss, and figuring out a relationship to the living world around us. So it is sort of the same sort of feeling in terms of science, and they'll talk a little bit about climate change as well. So should be interesting. And I would encourage anybody who wants to come to register at the library website. And now I can see tons of thanks and well done, Joanna. Terrific presentation. Good luck with your new book. I enjoyed every minute, so you can be happy to know that everybody has enjoyed this thoroughly. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for dropping by.